Macedon. A boy, watching King Philip win. Plutarch records the moment. Philip had just taken another city, another victory, another headline. The boy didn't celebrate. Instead, he turned around to the men around him and said, "My father will leave nothing for me to do." His companions laughed. "He's doing all of this for you," one of them said. "One day it will all be yours." The boy looked unconvinced. "But what good is it," he said, "if I possess much and accomplish nothing?" He was 7. Plutarch doesn't say this was the first time the thought crossed his mind, just the first time he chose to say it out loud. It would speak again, louder, every time he tried to close the gaps. His name was Alexander. To understand what he spent his life running from, you have to understand what he was handed before he'd done anything to earn it. His mother, Olympias, claimed descent from Achilles himself, a bloodline reaching back to the greatest name amongst the Greeks. His father, Philip II, had taken a backwater kingdom and turned it into the most feared military power in the Greek world. Alexander didn't just inherit a kingdom. He inherited a story that was already primed for greatness before he'd lived a day of it. This wasn't a cold household. Plutarch describes Philip and Alexander's relationship as competitive, not cruel, closer to two men racing each other than a tyrant and his son. Philip gave him real command, not just token power. At 16, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia while his father campaigned. And at 18, he led the decisive cavalry charge against the sacred band of Thebes at Chaeronea, the battle that broke Greeks' resistance to Macedonian rule for good. That's not how you treat a son you intend to overshadow. That's how you treat an heir, which is exactly the problem. Two parents, both convinced he was destined for something enormous, both actively pouring fuel onto that belief, long before he had any evidence to support it. Not a wound inflicted by neglect, a wound inflicted by being elevated constantly and too specifically for a future he hadn't built yet. By the time he was a teenager, the question wasn't whether he would do something remarkable. It was whether he could ever do enough. For years, the answer seemed obvious. Of course he would inherit everything. Then, at a wedding, the terms changed. Philip took a new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman, not a foreign princess like his mother Olympias. At the wedding banquet, her uncle Attalus raised his cup and offered a toast, a hope that this marriage would finally produce a legitimate heir to the throne. Macedonian succession had no fixed rule of blood. Kings decided, and a son's claim was only ever as strong as his father's backing. Attalus wasn't citing a law. He was making a bet out loud in front of the entire court that Alexander's claim could still lose. Alexander hurled his own cup at Attalus. Philip, drunk, furious, defending the insult to his new bride's family, drew his sword on his own son. He stumbled. The sword never fell. But the seed had already been planted. For the first time, succession wasn't a guarantee. It was a competition Alexander hadn't realized he was enrolled in. He dropped Olympias off in Epirus, then kept going alone, into Illyria, a kingdom he'd fought against years earlier, showing up now as a refugee instead of a conqueror. Not because he'd been disowned, because the foundation his entire identity stood on had a clause in it nobody told him about. 6 months later, a family friend named Demaratus said what no one else dared, that Philip had no business lecturing Greece about unity while his own house was falling apart. Philip sent for his son. Alexander came back. The wound never healed. In 336 BC, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. a man named Pausanias, at a festival in Aegae. Ancient sources whisper about who else may have been involved. Some implicate Olympias. A few even point toward Alexander himself. No source proves it. Historians still argue about it today. What's certain is simpler. Philip was dead, and at 20 years old, Alexander was king of Macedon. The inheritance he'd spent his whole life being promised had finally, actually arrived. It didn't feel like enough. It never would. He moved immediately, crushed rebellions in Greece, burned Thebes to the ground as a warning to anyone else considering resistance, then crossed into Asia to do what his father never lived to do, take on the Persian Empire itself. At Troy, before a single Persian soldier had been engaged, he made a detour. He visited the tomb of Achilles, ran around it, wept at it. He had reportedly carried a copy of the Iliad with him for years, annotated, studied, treated less like literature and more like a blueprint for the world. The bargain Achilles made, trade a long, quiet life for a short, glorious one, and let your name outlive your body. What he didn't carry with the same devotion was the sequel. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the underworld and finds Achilles among the dead. Achilles tells him he would rather be a poor farmer alive than king over every corpse in that place. Alexander knew the bargain by heart. He just never lingered on the sequel. At the Granicus River, his first real battle in Asia, Alexander did what he'd keep doing for the next decade, led from the front of the charge instead of behind it. In the chaos of crossing under fire, a Persian nobleman closed in from the side, sword already raised. Half a second from a blade through his skull. The strike never landed. A general named Cleitus, a man who'd known Alexander since they were boys in Macedonia, got there first, cutting the attacker down before he could finish the swing. Alexander didn't just survive his first battle in Asia, he survived it because of one specific man. The voice didn't go quiet. What followed was a decade where he simply didn't lose. Tyre held for 7 months under siege, until Alexander built a causeway out into the sea brick by brick rather than walk away. At Gordium, faced with a knot nobody could figure out how to untie, he cut it with his sword instead. Patience was never the tool he reached for first. Then Odysseus, then Gaugamela, and the empire that had terrified Greece for 2 centuries collapsed in under 10 years. He was 25. They were already calling him King of Asia. The voice should have stopped there. It didn't. 328 BC, deep in Central Asia, something in him had started shifting. He dressed more like a Persian king than a Macedonian one. He let himself be treated less like a general and more like something closer to a god. At a banquet in Maracanda, drunk, his old friend Cleitus, the same man who had put himself between Alexander and a blade 8 years earlier, said what nobody else in the room would say. "Your father never needed this. You used to be one of us." The room went entirely cold. For a few seconds, the man who ruled half the known world just stared at the friend who had saved his life. Then the voice took over completely. Alexander killed him, with his own hand, on the spot. The man who saved his life was murdered by the same hunger that life had been spent feeding. Years earlier, before any of this, before Tyre, before Gaugamela, before he'd taken a single Persian city, Alexander had passed through Corinth, newly confirmed as leader of the Greek alliance. The whole campaign still just a plan on paper. There, he met a man named Diogenes, a philosopher who owned nothing, lived in a barrel, and wanted for nothing as a result. Alexander, the story goes, offered him anything he wanted. Diogenes asked him to stand out of his sunlight. That was the whole request. Nothing else. Alexander later told his companions that if he weren't Alexander, he wished he were Diogenes. He said this before he'd conquered anything, and it changed nothing about what he did next. That's the part worth sitting with. He'd already met the answer to the question driving him. A man with nothing, who needed nothing, and was visibly, completely at peace. And he understood it, even said it out loud. Then he went and conquered the known world anyway. Not because he hadn't seen the alternative, because seeing it didn't turn the voice off. By 326 BC, his army had crossed into India and defeated King Porus at the Hydaspes, another undefeated battle added to a record that had never once needed a loss. Alexander wanted to keep going, further into India, further than any Greek had gone. His men said no. At the Achilles River, exhausted, far from anything resembling home, his army refused to march another step. Not the Persians, not a fortress, not a god. His own soldiers, the men who had followed him through everything, were the first force in his entire life the voice couldn't talk past. He gave in, turned back. For the first time, something said no before the voice did. The march home cost him more men than most of his battles combined, crossing the Gedrosian desert in brutal conditions. He made it back to Babylon, started planning the next campaign before he'd finished the last one. In 323 BC, after a prolonged fever following a long banquet, he died in Babylon. He was only 32. His generals gathered around him, asked who should inherit the empire. Ancient sources record his last words simply, "To the strongest." Not a name, not a son. He had no clear heir ready to take the throne. Not a plan, just an open invitation to whoever could take it. The empire didn't wait long to test the offer. Within years, his generals, the Diogenes, tore it into pieces, fighting each other for decades over what was left. The man who had spent his entire life terrified of inheriting everything and accomplishing nothing died having built something so entirely dependent on him that it couldn't survive him by more than a few years. He never named an heir, maybe because naming one would have meant admitting the campaigning days were over. And the voice never agreed that it was. He spent his entire life trying to outrun a feeling that no city, no empire, no title was ever going to fix. Somewhere in that same world, another man would be handed exactly what Alexander never had: a clean way out, freely offered, no war required. He said no. That story is next.